Good morning. Thank you for joining us on a wet morning at the King Institute for Faith and Culture. It's good to see so many here in spite of the rain. Bristol crowds tend to avoid the rain with all endeavor, and so it's good to have you here. As always, many hands are involved in a King Institute event. I'm grateful to those who helped so much with this one, to IT and to the teaching assistants and to Ivy Ritchie. Whether you're a King student or a member of the community, whether you're faculty or staff or simply a bystander in the wrong place, this event is for you. It's my hope that this event will capture your imagination and enliven your mind and stir your soul. It's my hope that you'll see here the ways in which Christian faith and culture intersect, inform each other, and instruct us today. We particularly want for the King Institute to foster conversation. And to that end, we offer, after the conclusion of this session, we're going to move to a little house called the Tadlock House, about a 3-minute walk from here, to have coffee and donuts. And you're all welcome, student, faculty, staff, and guests. Please join us to have some time with Philip there. About 11:20, we'll go to the cafeteria, and you're welcome to stop by and say hello, or indeed to join us for lunch. Tonight, Dr. Jenkins will speak again at 7 o'clock at Emmanuel Episcopal Church downtown. In 1979, Philip Jenkins, our speaker today, won the ultimate trivia quiz, the British show Mastermind. For this televised game show, he chose 3 subject fields in addition to general knowledge. His 3 fields: early Christianity, the Vikings, and medieval Wales, show a little of his breadth as a scholar. They also give me a chance to advertise the fact that tomorrow night at Bloom Cafe, we're going to have trivia for you, hosted by me. So you can come tomorrow night to Bloom and you get free coffee, and you're going to have a rollicking evening of trivia. I can guarantee no questions at all about early Christianity, the Vikings, or medieval Wales. But we will have we'll have a good time. So come join us tomorrow for that Slack event. That was a free advertisement on my part. Dr. Jenkins' breadth goes beyond his Mastermind categories. Among his 27 books are studies of early Christianity in Asia, the growth of the church in the global South, the lost Christianity of Asia and Africa, the Red Scare in Pennsylvania, designer drugs, terrorism, a broad history of the United States, and the violent verses in the Bible. His scholarly career, addressing this broad range of things, models what the King Institute, and really King University, wishes to cultivate: a mind attentive to the ways in which the Christian gospel applies itself in different times and places across the globe. Now, since this year our theme is remembrance and hope, and since we tend to remember things in multiples of 50, we like anniversaries, Dr. Jenkins is going to consider 2 anniversaries for us today. This morning, the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, an event which shaped a lot of modern life. His attention will be primarily on the church. Tonight, at 7 o'clock at Emmanuel Episcopal Church, he'll consider the 50th anniversary of a year of tumult and revolution, 1968. Something there? I'm back. So please come join us tonight as well for a look at 1968. Dr. Jenkins is a return visitor to King. He was here about 10 years ago for the Buechner Institute. This time we welcome as a first-time visitor his wife Liz, who's with us, sitting over there. Please join us afterwards in Tadlock to greet them both or at lunch. And please join me in welcoming Philip Jenkins.
Well, thank you very much. It's very good to be back at this beautiful campus and this lovely town. Quick word of explanation. You see I've got some PowerPoint slides here. They work much better in something like a regular classroom, and I don't think they're going to be much use here. Fortunately, I don't depend on them too much. You probably heard a saying, power tends to corrupt, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. Fortunately, I don't rely on that, but I've got some nice pictures, honestly. What I want to talk about today is how religions, and mainly the Christian religion, changes over time. And we tend to think of that maybe as like a pretty linear thing, and we think of it as a process of evolution, and people learn more and they write more and they get new ideas. I want to suggest something a bit different. I'm going to suggest that things jog along nicely for a while, but then there are eras of extreme, rapid, revolutionary change when everything is shaken up, thrown up into the air, and how it comes down, the new patterns that it forms, not something that we can predict easily. And within the Christian tradition, also other religions, what this usually means is a return to the sources. Nothing that you have been used to is anything you can rely on anymore. So you have to say, what can we rely on? Do we turn back to Scripture? Do we turn to prophecy? Do we turn to people who claim to be prophets, to maybe charismatic leaders who will say, God has told me what you want? And what I'm going to be looking at, and you can think of some of these years, 1517 was the start of the Reformation, and there was a lot of commemoration of that last year. I'm going to suggest that there are 2 years like that in modern times. One is 1918, one is 1968. And today I'm going to be talking about 1918. You know what the definition of a revolution is? It's a change so fundamental that after you've lived through it, you can never assume that things have ever been different. It's a new normal. It's a new inevitability. And that's what 1918 does. It creates a radical new normal, and we tend to think, the world has always been like this. No. So let's just start with the start of the First World War in 1914. It was a completely different Christian world from what it would be a decade later. It had a different geography. It had a different set of assumptions. And one of them was, for instance, the idea of Christendom, the idea that the state is allied to the church, not necessarily in the United States, but in most countries around the world. So, for instance, the Emperor of Germany is not just the Emperor of Germany, he is the supreme bishop of the German church. The King of England is the head of the Church of England throughout the empire. There's an extremely cozy, intimate relationship. And everyone knows that the world is going to move forward in this nice, rational, progressive way. There'll be more and more science. Then World War I happens. And the scale of devastation is astounding. Just to give you an idea of it, in the whole Vietnam War, the US lost approximately 60,000 dead over a period of 8 years. On one day in 1914, the French lost 26,000 dead. The scale of death is astonishing. They suffer 10 million military casualties over the 4 years. And then, as the war is ending and everything is coming to be, is kind of drawing to an end, then a plague breaks out, the plague of influenza, which adds probably between 50 and 100 million dead around the world, far more than are killed in combat. When you look at this, well, let me backtrack. It's very hard not to use supernatural interpretations for something like this. And one thing which absolutely shocks people as the war breaks out, you've got all these liberal, scientific, rational countries like England and Germany and the United States, and everyone is talking of what? Angels, Armageddon, apocalypse. There's a picture up there which is one of the very kind of common images you get of the war. And there is a story in 1914 that a besieged British force was about to be overwhelmed by the Germans when suddenly they were rescued by armies of, well, originally it's ghosts, but as the story emerges, of course, it's angels. And the more you look at World War I, the more stories you get of angels appearing. What happened in the victory? Oh, angels appeared. The dead rose to fight for us. When the Germans launched their great offensive in 1918, of course, what else could it be called? It's Operation Michael, after the leading archangel, who by this point has become something like a German war god. And I'm not saying anything about the Germans as such. All the countries have these very supernatural ideas. And in light of modern debates, one of the issues that the church has at the time is there is a widespread idea that if a soldier goes into battle and is killed fighting for his country, there are many people who will say, right, this day he has immediately become a holy martyr. He is immediately in heaven. Never mind what his past was. He was a murderer. He was a rapist. All those sins are washed away in the blood of his martyrdom. And if you say, this sounds like a modern theory of jihad, I would say, yeah, exactly. It's the same kind of idea. And this is from the most advanced Christian states. And if you look at the propaganda of the time, the assumption is that Christ is absolutely with us, whoever we are, whether we're the Germans, the Americans, whatever. There are furious debates in the American religious press as to, you know the phrase, what would Jesus do? And yes, everyone's convinced in most of the American religious press that if Jesus was around today, he would be enlisting to fight for civilization. And the debate is, yes, but would he actually use a bayonet? And a widespread consensus is, yes, he would. Because that's the only way to save civilization. And if you can deal with that image, good luck. And what the picture behind is, and obviously you can't read it there, is it's Jesus blessing German forces going into action. And what he's basically saying is, in this fight, thy will be done, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. In other words, you are fighting for the kingdom of God. Germany has something that you can only call a kind of religious revival in 1914, which is often described, people are so enthusiastic, so passionate about the war, that they call it still the New Pentecost. And they use these outrageous terms. Okay, so the war goes on, and everyone thinks it's going to be over in maybe 6 months. It isn't. 4 years later, it's still going on. And there's a very common idea that people become disenchanted. They become weary of all this religious stuff. Let me just say one thing. No. People become more, what's the word I want to use? Supernatural, superstitious, fanatical, if you like. And in an age of famine, plague, death, and war, the four horsemen, apocalyptic, messianic, holy war ideas become very widespread among very regular soldiers. And there are particular moments like that. In the Catholic world, for example, in 1917 is like this peak year. It's like 1517. These anniversaries are very neat. In 1917, there's a story, a bunch of kids report in Portugal having a vision of the Virgin Mary. And all the local skeptics say, sure you did. And the Virgin Mary tells them, if you turn out here next week, something really interesting is going to happen. And this is at a place called Fatima in Portugal. So 50,000 good Catholics turn out to see what the Virgin Mary is going to do. And 50,000 good secularists turn up to laugh at the Catholics. And then something happens, and I still don't know how to describe it, but you've got 100,000 people, including every journalist in Western Europe, looking up at the sky, and they're waiting for something to happen, and the secularists are giggling. and then the sun begins to dance in the sky. And people are thinking, this is really strange. And you can look at any number of meteorological journals which try to explain what the heck is happening here. But there is a widespread idea right up to the present day that this is one of the turning points in divine revelation to the world. The Virgin also gave 3 secrets to the children, which have been revealed over time. What are they about? Are they about the fall of communism? Whatever. Each country has its own kind of messianic ideas. The Germans form a messianic cult around Martin Luther. In 1917, when they celebrate the 400th anniversary of the Reformation, then you get hundreds of thousands of quite regular, intelligent Germans who believe that Luther is God's special messenger to the German people. And the key thing is to return the Bible to what it should be as a real Christian document, and let's get the Jews and the Jewish teachings out of the church. Let's get rid of the Old Testament. So everything is going, what we might say, is a little bit crazy. And then something happens in the fall of 1917. I hope that got your attention. That's fine, just leave it there. Thanks a lot. Sorry about that. I always have a problem. Because of my ethnic heritage, I tend to wave my arms a lot when I talk. And when I teach a class, I always warn people, do not attempt to come in while I'm in full flow. And in the fall of 1917, the British are fighting in Palestine against the Turks, and they're ready to capture the city of Jerusalem. And the British are very concerned about this. They do not want to set off any kind of big excitement or anything, because for one thing, if this leads to talk of crusade, great Christian event, then this will alienate Muslims around the world. So the British General Allenby says, now let's look at our calendars. We don't want to do this on any kind of big day. We don't want to do it on like Easter, okay? And they do this absolutely perfectly, apart from the fact they haven't looked properly at the Jewish calendar. So General Allenby occupies Jerusalem on the Feast of Hanukkah, which celebrates the ancient liberation of the Jewish temple. And everyone around the world knows this is an apocalyptic sign. The following year, General Allenby launches his decisive campaign against the Turks, and he wins one of the greatest battles of the First World War at, and I could make it a guessing game, but where's the worst place in the world you could do for this? Answer, Megiddo, the scene of Armageddon. Armageddon means the hill of Megiddo. He fights one of the greatest battles of the First World War and wins it at Megiddo. So let me see. We have the capture of Jerusalem. We have plague in the world. We've just had the Battle of Armageddon. Are we missing anything? The Virgin is appearing. Archangels are around the place. This is a very strange time. And like I say, where are we? Yeah. Oh, that's the other thing. If we are the kingdom of God, our enemy must be the devil. And all the way through the war, how can you tell the enemy in propaganda? They crucify. In other words, we are Christ. They are the crucifiers. Yeah, Miracle of Fatima. Hang on, that's the German celebration of Luther, and it's not working. And the one thing Allenby tells his soldiers is, for heaven's sake, don't talk about crusades. So all the books are called Khaki Crusaders. Where does all this go? Well, the first thing is it revolutionizes religions around the world. I'll come back to Christianity, but 1917 is an absolute turning point in the history of Judaism, for example. For years, the Jews have wanted a homeland in Palestine. And people said, no, this would be too sensitive, it would be too delicate. And virtually the week that Allenby takes Jerusalem, the British government issues a letter, which is still one of the most famous letters of the 20th century. It's called the Balfour Declaration, which tells the Jewish people, yes, His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine, provided that the rights of existing inhabitants are not compromised. That is the charter of the State of Israel, and still the Balfour Declaration is this key moment. Imagine the importance of Israel in Jewish history, and it happens very specifically because the British cabinet and the American president, Woodrow Wilson, are so committed to the idea of biblical prophecies, biblical ideas, and they believe that we live in apocalyptic times. Well, oh yeah. I don't know if you can see that one. This is Allenby's attempt to try and avoid religious interpretation. And I don't know if you can see it at all, but it's Hanukkah 165 BC and Allenby entering Jerusalem in 1917. And it's the same thing, and above is the figure of the great messianic leader of the world at this stage, who is Woodrow Wilson. Do you see how people are taking religious ideas and projecting them onto contemporary people? All right, so the point I'm trying to make is that by 1917, 1918, you have the foundations of the world being shaken. Kingdoms and empires that have existed for 1,000 years are ceasing to exist. You have famine, plague, death, and war. You have the idea of the apocalypse around. How does this affect the way people view the world? How do churches live? How do Christians live? How do believers live if they believe seriously that they're living in the last days? It's an interesting point. If you don't believe the signs of the apocalypse are all around you, you're not reading the newspapers. The secular media, the cinema is full of all these ideas. The best-selling book of the war is one called, altogether now, The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. It becomes a great film in 1920, which is about the war, the battles of the war, and actually shows the horsemen of the apocalypse riding above the battlefield. It makes a star of Rudolph Valentino apart from anything, but these are the sort of ideas that are around at the time. How does it affect religion? Let me give you a few things. The first thing is, up until 1914, there are three great shares of Christianity. There's Protestant, Catholic, Orthodox. 1/3 of Christianity, maybe more, is the great Orthodox Empire of Russia. In 1917, that empire is destroyed. It is replaced by the Soviet Union, which bitterly persecutes Christians, kills thousands of priests and nuns, kills maybe millions of ordinary Christian people. Basically, after the First World War, the Christian world is twofold. It's Protestant and it's Catholic. We've lost the Orthodox one. That doesn't strike us as being so amazing today, because it's always been like this. No, it's been like that since 1917. And before you tell me the Orthodox are still around, of course they are. But they are numerically a junior portion of that larger story. What else happens in these crucial years? In 1915, the Turks launch a persecution of the Christians in their empire. And you may think, well, gee, that's very sad, but it's a really small story. No. These are churches which date back to the 1st and 2nd centuries. They have always been there. Up until 1915, Christians represent a very large share of the Middle East. We tend to think of the Middle East today as being a Muslim territory with a few scattered Christians. Up until 1915, no. Probably 1.5 million Armenian Christians are murdered in the First World War in 1915, and that does not count many other non-Armenians in today what we call Syria, in Lebanon. The map of the Christian world we know today, a Protestant Catholic world with largely Christians departed from the Middle East, that's a World War I picture. Oh, and something else happens in World War I. Because of the war, European missionaries can no longer go out to countries in Africa or Asia. Churches in those countries have to depend on their own resources, and they begin growing like crabgrass, to use a theological metaphor. The numbers are amazing. I don't know how familiar you are with this, but back in 1900, the number of Christians in Africa, in the whole of Africa, is about 10 million, which is 10% of the whole. The number of Christians in Africa today is 500 million, and by 2050 it'll be a nice round billion. That is by far the largest quantitative change that has ever occurred in the history of religion. And if you look at the graph, there's one date where it starts to take off, and it's 1915. So it's almost as if one great portal is being closed, which is the original Christianity in the Middle East, but another far larger portal is being opened. And as they say, don't get me started on Asia. That's another vast story in its own right. The modern Christian world is invented in these years. And then move forward to 1918. So you have all these African churches around, and suddenly influenza hits. And influenza for us is a really nasty inconvenience. It kills how many people in Africa? 5 million? 8 million. And all those Africans who earlier had gone to the medical missions for Western medicine are given one of two things, aspirin or quinine, and let me tell you right away, those do not do a whole lot of good against a deadly influenza. And so they turn to churches that promise healing, native African churches. And it is the explosive growth of those churches which begins precisely during the influenza epidemic. That is one of the most important religious stories in the world today. It's a First World War story. Well, so how do other churches behave around the world? Protestant churches are very divided. The issue for them is that throughout the war, Protestant churches have very faithfully followed the state line. So, you know, they've always echoed the official slogans of the state. So the German slogan is, Gott strafe England, God punish England. Or to quote a poem of the time, Gott strafe England, God save the king. God this, God that, God the other thing. Good God, said God, I've got my work cut out. And so have theologians. Does that mean that the whole alliance with the state has been an error? Does this mean that different state churches need to reconsider, need to break away? And absolutely the most famous example of somebody involved in this is a Swiss theologian called Karl Barth. Lives in Switzerland, neutral country, but he's close enough that he can almost hear the guns firing on the Western front. And he reads all these declarations by German Protestant leaders saying, you know, we're 100% behind the Kaiser, doesn't matter how many million people die, we have to create God's kingdom on earth. And Barth starts thinking, and the books he turns out over the next few years, I mean, we're still wrestling with them today. They revolutionize theology. There's a phrase, when his first book appears in 1918, it's like a grenade thrown into the children's playground of the theologians, which is kind of a nice image. And what Barth says, basically, and I could speak about this for many hours, is we're wrong. God is not just what humans think, but spoken in a loud voice. God is totally different, ganz anders. He is incomprehensible to human reason. Reason fails. when God makes himself known to man. Man does not discover God. When God makes himself known to man, that gives us a chance of hearing something, but we can never understand. The closer he draws to us, the less we understand him. And what we have to do is make that humble pilgrimage back to the world of the Bible and of faith. Barth's theories, Barth's theologies echo for many, many years up to the present day. In the Catholic Church, they have an interesting situation. France is a secular state at this time, and what that means is they draft Catholic clergy. So a lot of Catholic clergy, Catholic priests, end up serving in the front lines, and oh brother, they are transformed by the experience. And there are a group of people who are going to be the most important theologians and thinkers of the next half century. And you say, where do you get these amazing ideas? Usually in the Battle of Verdun in 1916. I was sitting in a foxhole and a shell exploded over there, and I thought, why did that man die and I survived? What are God's purposes? What is God doing in this war? Who are some of these people? A man called Jacques Maritain, founder of most modern ideas of human rights. The UN Declaration of Human Rights owes a huge amount to him. Henri de Lubac, who imagined a whole new Christendom, not one tied to militarism, not one tied to the state, but imagining the church representing pluralism, representing the individuality of people. Teilhard de Chardin, who had this vision growing out of evolution of the human race, the church progressing through time, through this culminating moment. And if you ever look at the history of the Catholic Church, they have a great moment in the early 60s called the Second Vatican Council, when they announce all these changes which reverse so much of what the church has done for the last 1,000 years. Who are the thinkers behind this? Well, de Lubac, Maritain, and a lot of other people who owed their experience to the First World War. The Pope at the time was a man called Pope John the 23rd. Where was he in the First World War? He was a stretcher bearer on the Italian front. And, you know, the Catholic Church, things tend to take a little bit longer. So people have these traumatic experiences in 1917, and they result in policy in 1963. You know, what's 1,000 years between friends? They last on a long time scale. But if you want to imagine the Catholic story, what's happening there is happening in 1917 and 1918. And incidentally, something they never really tell you about in terms of religion and the war. The Pope at the time is a man called Benedict XV. Benedict XV is one of the few religious leaders who really comes out of the First World War as a great hero. And he makes a real serious effort to end the war. Well, repeated serious efforts. He believes in peace. He tries to promote peace. And his great idea, how's this for a radical thought in 1916, is what we're going to do. Just suppose we got all the countries of Europe and we got them into something called a United States of Europe, a European Union. And what we're going to do is all the countries take all the money that they spend money on right now for weapons, and they put them into social welfare and helping society. How's that for an idea? Did that idea go anywhere? Well, sometime, if you ever look at the European flag, the European Union, you ever seen it? It's a blue background, and it's a number of stars. And it's a very interesting picture, because all the way for like the last, 1,000 years, whenever you depict the Virgin Mary, you depict her on a blue banner, surrounded by stars with the figure of the Virgin in the center. And when they created the European flag in the 1950s, what they did was they went back to Benedict XV. So they did the Marian flag. They took out the Virgin Mary, so not to offend Protestants and Jews, but they knew between themselves, we're still following what the Pope wanted. Did the First World War create our modern religious world? Yes. It also let loose a lot of other currents which are more controversial. Remember I said people believed they were living in the time of the apocalypse? They believed in the end time. Protestants like Bart wanted to go back to the Bible. What's our absolute source? Where did we go wrong? Catholics like de Lubac wanted to go back to the early fathers, the early traditions of the church, figure out where we went wrong. How come we got tied up, allied with churches with countries like Germany and Italy and France? Why doesn't the church exist on its own values? But there were other people who tried to go back to ideas of prophecy, of charisma. The 1920s are a great time. If you wanted to be a Messiah in the 1920s, it was a great time. The career opportunities were wonderful, the benefits were superb. It was an excellent time to be a charismatic leader, a prophet, a Messiah. And you know, I'm not kidding. If you just catalogue the number of people who claimed to be Messiahs in the 1920s, they are all over the place. You probably know a very famous poem by W.B. Yeats, which is much quoted when he was commenting on this tendency or this nightmare of these very frightening figures. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And the last two lines of that poem, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. It's a very frightening poem. He was imagining the coming of an Antichrist. There were plenty of Antichrist figures at that time. And there's one thing I would say. If I asked you to think of like religious movements of the 20s and 30s, maybe you wouldn't come up with many. But there are a great many movements in the 20s and 30s that are inspired by this religious impulse, but they pursue a secular apocalyptic. And what I mean is, they use apocalyptic language, they use end-of-the-world language, but they put it in secular terms. Think of it. I've been fighting this war for the kingdom of God. I'm fighting a holy war. I'm a crusader. How could I possibly lose? Oh, we lost. How do we explain that? There must be some really evil force in our country, and they're the ones who are serving the devil, and they've thwarted the aims of the kingdom of God. In Germany, of course, it's the Jews. You cannot understand the Nazi movement except in terms of taking all these apocalyptic ideas and putting them in secular style. You know, there's a great example of how Latin works. One of the greatest theologians in Germany at the time was a man called Reinhold Seeberg, and Seeberg was the mentor of people like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he was a great theologian. And he was asked to compose an epitaph for the students of the University of Berlin who'd been killed in the war. He did this in like 1919. And this is the whole thing. I'll recite to you the whole epitaph. Invictus, Victi, Victuri. And I'll translate that as to the unconquered, from the conquered, who will themselves conquer. In the words of the prophet Schwarzenegger, we'll be back. And I just end with one poem. You can also see the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, the communists fought this bitter anti-religious war. But everything in their style was taken from apocalyptic language. Don't forget, Stalin was a dropout from a seminary. This is not a coincidence. And one of the great poems of 1918 is one called The 12. And it goes like this. It's by a man called Alexander Bloch. And he tells the story of a bunch of Red Guards who are extreme Bolshevik thugs going around the streets and beating people up and getting into fights and shooting a prostitute who is done something wrong, and these are the worst thugs in the world, and these are the leading edge of the revolution. There are 12 of them. Their leader is called Pete, or Peter, and the poem ends like this. And they walk through this blizzard, and they see this distant character wandering ahead of him, and they see he's carrying a red flag, and they don't know who he is, but really, it's Jesus Christ. And is that meant to be a joke? Is that meant to be an attack? Or is it what it more probably is? Alexander Bloch seeing an apocalyptic Christianity in the Russian Revolution. In my second hour, I'll work through the PowerPoint slides. No, I won't. I know I have to wind up pretty close there, but what I'm trying to say is 1918 is a year of amazing planted seeds and false hopes of dreams and visions, and the churches and other religions would live them and think through them up to the present day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. By way of reminder, Tadlock for coffee and donuts if you're interested in joining us. Enjoy your afternoon. Thank you.